Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this spinning, tumultuous, fast forward planet, which is full of stresses right now and uncertainty and lots of certainties, one of which is that we're in the middle of a pandemic and the world is warming. The uncertainties, though, are manifest. And there are certain people who kind of gravitate to situations like this to see if they can make a difference organizationally, structurally, analytically. And one of them is Jeff Sachs, who I've known now over 2 decades. I'm sure we must have met sometime back in the past when I was a reporter and you were mainly an economist. I think you do so much more than economics, though, as we'll find out in a minute. And I kind of summoned you here for Sustained What, Jeff, because the whole point of this enterprise, these webcasts, which I started in mid-March around the pandemic, is to navigate through uncertainty, to make connections that aren't yet made, to build conversations toward objectives like making information matter around this virus amid the infodemic, as the World Health Organization aptly calls the information environment we're immersed in right now. And you're kind of like a buzzing bee. You have some qualities that I think I have, but much more depth in many ways than I have in terms of having spent so much time digging in on sustainability concepts. And so it's great to have you here to navigate this multi-crisis thinking and doing landscape. How are you doing today?
It'll be fun to talk about all of this with you, Andy. Thanks for all of your leadership and helping the world understand our challenges and crises and doing that so brilliantly for so many years. So I'm really delighted to be with you.
It's a two bidirectional honor, and I'm hoping people will weigh in comments and questions. This broadcasts live to LinkedIn and YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and all kinds of places. So let's get going. I think the first thing to do is just to ask you, what is it like when you wake up and you now have simultaneous challenges that you're working on pretty aggressively? We'll get into them in a few minutes. The Amazon, the Lancet Commission on COVID-19, that would be the first thing we'd like to talk to you about. But I guess I'll start out by saying, what do you wake up and do first, other than brush your teeth and have coffee?
I wake up to Zoom and I go to sleep to Zoom. It's pretty much all day now, intensively interacting with people all over the world, trying to figure out what we can do better and what we can do together. For many years now, it's actually 25 years, I've been leading development organizations at Harvard, then at Columbia University, at the UN, to try to bring knowledge to bear on policy and on politics. And of course, politics is pretty resistant to knowledge often. This is one of the big struggles. But with the multiple crises that we have right now, as you noted, it's really over the top. And we also have a very profoundly difficult and confused political and cultural environment in the United States. And this just adds to the challenge.
It does. We'll talk about the United States in a second. Let's break it down a little bit into some of the priorities. Obviously, the pandemic is priority one. And as I'm sure you know better than anyone, the pandemic is not one thing. It's the biological event, it's the social event, it's the economic event, which is really, well, how would you characterize if this pandemic was a finite book of 10 chapters, the economic ramifications? Are we on chapter one? Are we in the prologue? Are we in terms of the impacts and how that's going to play out?
Well, let me start by saying that in my career, I kind of stumbled into public health in a way. Though married to a wonderful doctor, I've always been aware of health and medical issues. But it was really when I was working on economic development in Africa 20 years ago that the AIDS pandemic hit me in the face, and
Right.
the malaria resurgence. And so for about 20 to 25 years now, I've been working on epidemics. And this is the latest and by far the most dramatic, but things that I saw already in the late 1990s and when I chaired a commission for WHO in 2000, 2001 on macroeconomics and health were really forerunners of this. The AIDS pandemic was not only a health crisis and a human tragedy, it was also an economic disaster, especially for its epicenter in Africa. Malaria, similarly, is a very complex disease, a horrific taker of life, and also a tremendous burden on economies in holoendemic areas. So this interaction of disease, health, economics is actually part of the norm, but to have a global pandemic, of course, is something extraordinary. And really, this is the most extraordinary event of this kind since the 2018 flu epidemic, and arguably it's as dramatic or even more consequential than that in many ways. What do we have? We have a massive public health crisis, a lot of people dying, a lot of people suffering, a new disease that scientists and clinicians are trying to understand. I think recent news that this is a disease that not only kills, but can create long-term complications and disabilities is really a serious finding. Obviously, the world economy is in more turmoil than it has been since the Great Depression. The inequalities being caused by this pandemic are profound within any society and also across the world. Rich countries print money and keep their societies functioning. Poor countries are just in desperation, and we see hunger and deaths rising as a result of that. So this is an extraordinary challenge. And like everything we'll talk about, Andy, it's made more extraordinary by the failures of politics, which is something I've come to expect and know over my career, but I've never seen anything like the failure of the U.S. politics as we're seeing today.
Yeah, and there are a few others, Brazil too, where I've spent so much time. It's just terrible to see what's unfolding there and here. And I guess what's illustrated there too is this weird reality with the pandemic. You know, public policy, well, as some of my friends in public health say, there's the word public is a big part of public health. In other words, what people do as individuals. And when you have a country as variegated as the United States, culturally, politically, you end up almost knowing, it's almost a certainty that you'll never have an even policy. And then you add on to that, of course, the signaling that's come from this White House and the like. And I guess that gets to the point of what you wake up and do. Then it's like, so what is the Lancet? Maybe if you could talk about the Lancet Commission as a kind of a way to navigate how you approach a problem like this.
You know, when I think of the word public, I think of it meaning something else also, not just the public, but also the public sector. Because usually when you think about public health or public policy, we're talking about government. That's something where the United States is absolutely messed up right now because we don't have that kind of public policy. And some of the right-wing Trump supporters that have marched were quoted as saying, it's not the government's role to tell me how to stay healthy. And that is actually a pretty good example of what has collapsed in American culture. Of course, it's the government's role to help citizens stay healthy. That's one of the most basic roles of government, but not in the extreme libertarian craziness that took over the United States over the last 40 years in some parts of our culture and some parts of our politics, because an expression like that is an expression of culture, which I think is dead wrong and literally dead wrong, but also is part of our politics right now. We don't have a public response. So what is happening is extraordinary, and it has many different elements to it, but you mentioned Brazil. I'm thinking a lot about the remarkable convergence of the US and Brazil these days. We look a lot like each other. We have in Brazil and in the US populistic, anti-science, demagogic, disastrous leaders to start out with. Trump and Bolsonaro are two of a kind. They reflect a certain cultural part of their societies, actually in both cases, evangelical, Protestant, white groups that are antagonistic to other groups in society. So there's a cultural component. There's a political component, which is that they represent definitely a far less than half of the population. But given the failed politics and the political institutions of our countries, they don't have to have a majority to govern. Both Brazil and the United States, sadly, have presidential systems. This is the first thing I would do differently if I were back in 1789. We should not have presidents. Actually, a monarch that is a constitutional monarch with a legislature which has a coalition which needs a majority is a far better system. And so we have these, I'll just put it out bluntly. I think Trump is mentally disordered and extremely dangerous, but he is able to govern day by day, if you call it that, by executive order. So right. To come back to your right. basic point, from the start of the epidemic, I tracked daily what was happening in different parts of the world. That is second nature to me as a policy analyst for 40 years now. I'm a comparativist. So from the very first days, really from the lockdown in Wuhan on January 23rd, I've been voraciously looking at daily comparative data every day. And what I saw already by early February was that the Asia Pacific countries, and specifically China itself after the initial outbreak, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and then by mid-February starting to see surprisingly Vietnam, then going into March noting that Cambodia and Laos, PDR, same way. And surprising to me, Australia, because Australia has some of the U.S. Politics and culture. Definitely New Zealand, all basically had this pandemic contained, whereas it was running wild in France, Italy, Spain, UK, and in the U.S. We didn't really know what was happening, but we knew it was spreading. And in fact, it was spreading far more than we knew because our public health system in the public government dimension completely failed in the United States. CDC completely failed to understand what was happening. So as late as early March, CDC was saying we have a handful of cases when we know there were thousands and thousands of cases. At that point, it was completely out of control. So the basic story, Andy, is that some part of the world, not a majority of it, but some part of the world showed early on that this was a containable epidemic. Right. The North Atlantic region, meaning Western Europe and the United States, failed to contain the epidemic. And then the drama since mid-March has been the late arrival of the virus in the developing world. The developing world didn't see the initial introduction of the virus because it wasn't as connected through travel with China and with Europe. But then I think the basic lesson is it's spreading everywhere now. In the Americas are a complete disaster. It's spreading more slowly in Africa. It finally exploded in India. So the picture today, which I look at several times a day, is Asia Pacific battling outbreaks, but still basically having this under control, maybe fewer than 10 new cases per million population per day. Much of Europe with some control, but not great. The United States with 200 per million cases per day. The Americas a disaster, and developing countries in bad shape. In other words, the world has not contained this, even though it is containable.
Right, and that's where you can end up with this cycle of reinfection, and
Absolutely.
such a tough situation. Very early here, we did a live session with a community group in Bhopal, India, when the lockdown order had come in, on the impact of the lockdown on the poor. And they had sort of self-organized a food network using WhatsApp to distribute food. Middle-class people were kind of cooking or preparing or collecting food and moving it around. There is that ingrained part of us that wants to do those things at the same time. But as you say, without the institutional framework, even that part is going to be a real mess. So maybe that's a route into the economics too.
Well, I think, Andy, the lesson of that is the following: if you lock down a country and basically break the economy during that period, the virus doesn't transmit enough to create an ongoing epidemic. We say technically that the basic reproduction number falls below 1, right, so that on average each infectious person infects fewer than one other individuals. So a lockdown does that, but you can't lock down an economy on an ongoing basis. So if you're knowledgeable and sensible and science-based and evidence-based, you use the lockdown period to put in place the true suppression or containment measures, which are testing, tracing, quarantining, face masks, public hygiene, stopping large meetings, which are super spreader events. In other words, there's a checklist of things to do. I watched dumbfounded in the United States that we went into a lockdown across the country from the middle of March onward. But this idiotic politics that we have completely failed to use the time to actually put in place the longer term measures. So we have a president who is absolutely an idiot and venomous, in my view, a psychopath, who wasted all of our country's time with confusion, hydrochloroquine, every bit of nonsense you can imagine, just not public health measures. And the governors, you think of DeSantis or Kemp or Abbott in Texas, Kemp in Georgia and DeSantis in Florida, just horrible people to have in positions of responsibility when so many deaths are going to occur under their irresponsible and incompetent watch, because those states did not use this time at all to actually build up the public health system. So I wrote a string of op-eds and editorials in early April saying, okay, use the time. This is how you do it. Look at East Asia and all the rest. They were attacked by the right wing. We've got to open the economy. Every bit of, I think, populistic nonsense by people who don't know but don't care to know. And in fact, it became tiring to say the same thing every day. That, there's a part of the world that has it under control. Look at them. And if I said that, I'd say, look at China, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, Vietnam. And then what would come back from the right? The Chinese communists are liars. How can you trust them? You're so naive. How shoddy you are to teach in an American university. First, I had said about 10 countries. And second, just this attitude. So there's something culturally so self-destructive in the United States right now. Today, there's another foolish, ignorant editorial in the Wall Street Journal, which is part of this Murdoch empire, which feeds this kind of cultural venom. Again, mass confusion within the space of about 500 words. Not that the Wall Street Journal editorial page typically gets it right, but my point is that we're fed with such confusion that's why we have 150,000 deaths today. Because our country, rich as it is so incompetent in the political sphere to actually do even the most basic things right now. That's my big puzzle, Andy. You know, when I started 40 years ago, actually almost 50 years ago as a student, but 40 years ago as a trained professional economist, I actually had the view the United States could do a lot of things right in the public sphere. I was a child of the moonshot, you know,
me too.
And very proud of it. And now we can't even figure out to have face masks worn in our country. 150,000 deaths into this pandemic.
So let's circle back. We'll have time toward the end to circle back to some of these themes. And this is such a troubling one. You know, I've done probably half a dozen webcasts on here just on the propaganda, disinformation universe and how that plays and ramifies. So let's go next to the bigger, grander scheme of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which you've worked so hard, so long on. And, you know, the clock there is ticking. We have toward 2030. This isn't a mechanistic thing. Obviously, it's not like you turn a knob and the world is adequately fed and deep poverty is ended. But you have created these indicators, this sort of set of data, vital signs. Could you just describe briefly, stepping back from the pandemic, toward the grander goal of what we might be able to see on this planet in 2030?
Great. Thanks. You know, I'll step back even a bit before the SDGs just to give us a warm-up ramp. This really dates back to 1948. The idea that we could have a better world that we create together. And I would say the even foundational document for that vision is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which all UN member states sign and which commits all UN member states to a world in which everybody has basic political and civil rights and economic needs met. In other words, social protection, health, education. These have been commitments since Eleanor Roosevelt brought the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to fruition in 1948. From that point, the UN launched every decade a decade of development, basically to realize these economic rights. Why, in a world of so much technology and know-how, should people be so chronically hungry that children are wasting or dying of malnutrition? Why should millions die every year of easily treatable causes, whether it's malaria, which can be treated with an 80-cent dose of artemisinin and combination drugs, or countless other diseases which are easily prevented or treated? And every decade or so, the UN entered into a new chapter. Progress was made, to be sure. In 2005, I wrote a book called The End of Poverty, saying that given our technological path and extrapolating, if we're nice to each other, we could end poverty by the year 2025. And that was based on analysis. In fact, a country like China went from 80% poverty around 1980 to zero today. It's achievable because we have the means, the productivity, the technologies to do it. But it requires public organization, and it requires being nice to each other. Right. Be the least among thee, if I could quote Matthew 25. And so the point is that it takes an effort. Now, in 2000, the UN member states adopted the Millennium Development Goals. I worked 15 years on those, day in, day out. A lot of progress was made. The number of deaths of children came way, way down from 13 million deaths in 1990 of children under the age of 5 to under 6 million deaths in 2015, it's still gnawed on me because I know almost all of those deaths would be easy to stop as well. But in 2015, to come to your question, in this next phase of UN targeting, the UN member states actually put the goal, end extreme poverty by 2030. And that was a stretch goal, to be sure, but feasible if we tried. And I, as usual, went to work trying to show the numbers. How could it be done? What kind of fiscal resource mobilization would be needed? How much would rich countries need to transfer to poor countries? Something that conservatives hate and have attacked me for decades. But we should give money from rich people and rich countries to the poorest people so that they can live, stay alive, and get started in development. Well, all of this is to say the goals were good ones, and those goals adopted in September 2015 were complemented by the Paris Agreement on climate, which was reached in December 2015. So we have a package of global objectives. And then, of course, no sooner did that happen than the United States found itself with a psychopathic president, completely against globalization, completely against multilateralism, completely against the UN system. And so we launched the SDGs with what I regard as the worst presidency in American history, though historians may tell me that James Buchanan in 1857 was worse. I'm not sure. But Trump is certainly at the very bottom of the heap and is a disaster. And when you have the lead country of the world that becomes the lead antagonist of multilateralism, even to the point of pulling out of the World Health Organization at the height of the COVID pandemic, you know this is a hard challenge. Well, to bring it up to your screenshot, I think, of SDGs Today, we're trying to measure in real time what's happening. And what's happening is that while there was some progress, not fast enough to achieve the SDGs, that's for sure, up until 2020, almost all of that progress has been brutally pushed aside by COVID. Children are not in school, poverty is up, hunger is up, even routine immunizations are not being done. And so, you know, we're really badly set back. And until this pandemic is ended or contained, let me put it that way, we're going to have a massive struggle. And when the dust settles, the world's going to be even more unequal, more unfair, and with more people suffering than certainly it was when we went into this epidemic at the start of 2020.
One thing that you mentioned, one thing that I was hoping as the as circumstances are playing out here, that I think that a lot of Americans who might not normally think about the care economy, meaning the non-monetized parts of the economy that support the whole system of public health, whether it's at home, home care, an elder, or whether it's all the workers, the orderlies in hospitals, in those surge emergency rooms, not just the pulmonologists. It felt like a moment when we saw all around us that having it, whether it's a basic income, a basic, you know, the sort of the, even if you're selfish about the economy, it illustrated that a basic level of income, basic level of support is in your own interest as a citizen. I don't know if that's catching on or not, or did you see, is that a lost opportunity? And that also relates to what you said about rich and poor nations. Of course, it's the same concept.
Well, nothing's ever a lost opportunity because the truth of all of these things is nothing is ever won definitively either. Right. In this kind of struggle, it is a day in, day out struggle to make achievements and progress and convince people and try to shift public norms and understanding and ideas. And now that I've been doing it myself for 40 years. I always thought, I'm sure for the first 30 of them, more or less, there would be the moment of victory, and then things would be fine.
Right.
And there is, of course, no such thing. There's progress and there's regress. And when there's progress, it can be followed by regress. When there's regress, it can be turned around. I hope in the United States, the first turnaround is in the November election. Truth be told, Andy, if Trump is reelected, I have little confidence for the safety of America or for the world. He's, in my opinion, so mentally disordered that he's a very, very dangerous individual. Other people say, no, he's a tactical politician. I fear it's much worse than that.
Well, one thing that's been so troubling is that the Republican Party in general, seems to essentially be passive. And whatever you think of Trump, there's this systemic aspect to the momentum that's been developed around his approach.
It is very striking, and I absolutely spend hours a day thinking about this also. We have a political phenomenon, somebody who has approval of 40%, hard for me to understand, but he does, and opposition of 55%, governs basically by decree. And so the way our political system works, which is basically no legislation in between elections and a tax cut here and there, but just presidential orders, presidential decrees, emergency decrees, some of which are overthrown by courts or not. But we have one-person government right now. We don't have Congress passing laws other than these money laws. And this is weird enough. But there is also a cultural phenomenon in the United States. We really are deeply divided. And Trump does represent part of American culture. It's hard for me to understand it. To my view, it's a very unattractive feature, but it's a kind of heartlessness. We had a lot of right-wingers, I don't know a better word for it, and it's partly evangelical Protestant right-wingers saying, well, deaths are deaths, get over it, get back to work. A kind of cruelty combined with ignorance that I hadn't really seen to this extent before. I don't think it's been on display probably since the 1960s, the brutality against the civil rights movement. But it's definitely there. So we have a cultural issue and a political issue. But having said all of that, you know, if Biden wins the election in November and has a majority of public support behind him, maybe we'll feel better and actually be able to have democratic processes working again, where government is not run by decree, but is run by legislation that commands a majority of public support.
Well, we'll see how that plays out. Maybe we'll, for the rest of the conversation, we'll sort of take it as if we're in January, and there actually is a decision. We'll see. Hopefully, the process will play forward. There's some comments coming in on related to the SDGs still. Paula,
let's talk about that. So much to talk about there.
Paula Bettelli says, perhaps anchoring the whole set of goals in a few anchoring priorities, such as health, productivity, nature, and governance, may be a good way of addressing them in the current COVID-19 context. And adds, once some recovery is achieved, in these priority areas, others can be given more focus, a step at a time, and continuous reassessment are the keys to success. It's funny, there's a line in your book I'm going to bring up in a minute about reassessment and adaptive leadership. Mm-hmm. So that feels like an interesting comment there. Let's take this to the Amazon too. We both were on a call a week or so ago related to a part of the world that even within Brazil it's an abstraction to most Brazilians. The Amazon, I once wrote, when I wrote my book about the Amazon, I said the Amazon is to Brazil what Alaska is to Americans. It's this remote frontier but it's got all this global significance. It's a fountain of biodiversity, and it's a climate feature. It's home to several hundred indigenous peoples, and it's now under assault from the virus too. And so, when you do your daily Zoomy flow, I know some of that's been even with our friends at the Vatican on the building a force around the Amazon. Could we just talk briefly about that and maybe Brazil? We have about 20 minutes left. We want to get in 2 or 3 other beats here. So just a brief
Fantastic. And let me say, now we're in the optimistic phase because we're thinking of January 2021 and a rebuilding phase. So to Paolo's question, I like to think of the SDGs as 6 broad transformations. Very quickly, the education, skills, technology transformation is number 1. Health for all is number 2. The clean energy and industry is number 3. Sustainable land use is number 4. Sustainable cities, number 5. And a digital economy for all is number 6. If you take those 6 transformations, education, health, energy, land, cities, and digital, to my view, you meet all 17 of the goals. So there are some broad thematic areas, and it helps me to simplify the agenda, which otherwise is 17 goals and 169 targets and so on. I like to think of 6 big transformations, and every one of them is feasible. And in fact, I'm a big fan of the digital economy. I didn't want to be pushed into it headlong through a pandemic, but the digital economy allows for global reach if we ensure connectivity for all. Right. And some of my friends, Professor Virgilio Viana in the Amazon region based in Manaus, is actually working with indigenous communities to provide telemedicine to indigenous communities upriver along the Amazon. So there are wonderful things that can be done in e-health, in e-education. You're showing a picture of the Amazon. One of the pictures that we take twice a day, actually, is a low Earth orbital satellite picture of the Amazon, which can measure deforestation literally day by day once you have someone who can translate those pixels appropriately. Right. And we need that too to monitor the illegal logging and the destruction that Bolsonaro has unleashed in this region. So one of the things that the UN network that I direct, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, has really been delighted to champion is a science panel for the Amazon, which you're part of, Andy, which brings together the top scientists from within the Amazon region, from the basin, for all the countries from the Amazon basin. And that is enabling science to make clear for all of us the tipping points, the dangers, and the direction for sustainable development. And I'm looking forward to having daily recordings of the deforestation. Mr. Bolsonaro will try to stop Brazilian agencies from knowing that, but the whole world will see what's really happening in Brazil and push the Brazilian government to some measure of responsibility.
I'm hopeful too. There's so much going on with. We just did a session here 2 weeks ago, with teachers. There are teachers in Massachusetts and Iowa who are working with a young innovator in technology, Dan Hammer. They have a thing called Earthrise.education, where students, even in lockdown, were sifting through satellite images showing gold mining activity in the Yanomami Reserve. And that sifting that they did then led to a Reuters story that was a big deal, and that added to pressure that there was a judge in Brazil that recently ruled on excluding the mining incursions from the reserve. Obviously, it takes more than a decree to make that happen in today's Brazil, but that shows the power of connectivity and data.
I agree with you. And by the way, when we looked together at the new Amazon website last week, I sent the link to Pope Francis, who was absolutely delighted and congratulated all the scientists on this, because he launched a synod, that is a meeting of bishops for protecting the Amazon and the indigenous populations in the Amazon, and he's paying a lot of attention. And so we have a lot of our greatest moral leaders that care about this. And if we can provide the data, the information, if students can provide story maps about the Amazon, the power of this, I do believe, can overwhelm the irresponsible politicians who do so much damage and have so little knowledge of their own.
Yeah, there's a comment that came in from Les Kaufman, who's someone I know, who talking about your list didn't really fully integrate the oceans. Of course, I think it's integrated there in those basic concepts, at least in terms of feeding the world. Water and the oceans are critical.
Yeah, actually, when we talk about these 6 transformations, I shortened it, but it's sustainable land use and sustainable fisheries and ocean use. So, and when I talk about clean industry, it's also circular economy and stopping the awful pollution of the oceans, the toxics and the plastics. So definitely the oceans are in there, both in the industrial ecology sense and in the ecozone conservation sense.
Let's get to your book briefly, which I have several of your earlier books on my shelves here. And I've read chunks of this one. I haven't finished it yet, but there was some passages. There's a passage I'm going to show in a minute. And I like this concept of breaking down what we think of as globalization into these long periods of time, very short when you think about Earth history. This is all the early stages of what's now the Anthropocene, the digital age, the industrial age, going back in time, the ocean age, the classical age. There's one thing that's happening now with globalization, reflected in the pandemic and climate change too, where the systems, the toughest challenges for us seem to be globalized. The globalization of our connectivity in the context of biology now. A virus was able to leapfrog from a species to another somewhere in China 6 or 7 months ago and sweep the world, and it's still unfolding. That shows you that connection between biology and our global dynamic. And of course, climate, a CO2 molecule from China or the United States has the same heating effect when it gets in the atmosphere. So there's this, essentially, any solution space on those tough issues, if it's not global, will implicitly fail. Is there another one to add at the end of the list there? I mean, guiding globalization in the 21st century has to integrate what we were just talking about, I guess.
I think the analytical starting point for me is the economic concept of public goods, and public goods are things that we want, like conservation or fighting a pandemic, that can't be handled by market forces, that need to be handled by cooperative, shared activities, mainly through government. And in economics, we talk about local public goods, things that cities need to do, national public goods, what nations need to carry out, regional public goods, for example, European-wide energy sector interconnectivity, and global public goods. And climate change, stopping greenhouse gas emissions, or fighting this pandemic are global public goods. And our political systems, at the most, are organized in most parts of the world around local and national public goods. And when you have a nationalist president like Trump, or at least that's his rhetoric, the attention is on what the nation should do. But key public goods, whether it's renewable energy on a continental scale, managing rivers that cut through many countries, or handling those truly global challenges require cooperation across national boundaries. Well, again, what Trump only thinks of win and lose, zero sum. The idea of global cooperation is beyond him. It's part of his psychopathology individually, I think, as well as his limited understanding of things. But it is the case that in our world today, we urgently need global cooperation. And in the last chapter of this book, I talk about how that could actually happen. I'm a big believer that one other category that is needed is the regional level, beyond the nation, but not fully global. And that's why I like the European Union so much. And I like ASEAN, and I like the African Union. And I would like East Asia not to be divided in a pro-China, anti-China sentiment, but united to solve problems. For example, in this new Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which combines the 10 countries of Southeast Asia and ASEAN, plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. So I envision a world of regions that are organized to solve regional problems above the national level, and those regions cooperating with each other, because that wouldn't be so hard to bring about. And that way we could actually even have the bandwidth to reach that level of cooperation. And that's what I think is needed for our new age.
There's several great questions that came in just now. I'm going to go through them a little bit, but one of them brought to mind this question from me. Along with those 6 sustainability organizing themes, are there system properties that are implicitly sustainable, implicitly leading to a more sustainable planet? And when I think about that, I think about transparency, resiliency, and of course, how do you measure resiliency is a challenge my disaster risk friends talk about. But if I keep stumbling into conversations, some of which I've hosted here, that have this I wouldn't call it post-governmental, because it's not post-governmental, but where the organizing principle is open data, open access into information that drives honesty on where your products came from, that, as you said with Brazil, demonstrates to anyone, you don't need to worry about Brazil's own statistics if you have fact-checking capacity, if you have more connectivity for indigenous communities so they can tell their story directly to the internet and get picked up by the New York Times without a reporter having to be the interpreter. I keep getting excited about examples in that arena. It's kind of it's not top down. This came to me. I want to show you something here. In 2015, when the SDGs were being that week or month, there was a meeting in New York City on climate and civilization, and a sustainability analyst, Heriberto Cabezas, I sat in on a presentation. He had a very sophisticated model, big sophisticated mathematical model, charting human prospects for the next 200 years. And his conclusion was the words at the right: coordinated manipulation of at least 6 variables is necessary to maintain stability for 200 years or so. Mm-hmm. And I immediately was like, oh my God. My hand went up. I said, just doesn't feel like the world I know, or even the world I would want. And he said, well, I asked him, so where would that come from? Or is that, if that's not possible, then what's possible? And he said, well, we lack a cultural narrative that says sustainability is really important. We have a cultural narrative that says murder is wrong. We don't have one that says managing our planet in a way that allows us to live on it as long as we can as a species is probably the most important thing. And it got me over and over again back to this: is there a system, an immune system for the planet, as the folks at Atlantic Council put it, where we can sort of feed data into your SDGs today and have that sensory, receptive, responsive property? Or is that too much to think?
Well, it's a great question. It's a very deep question. And I think the core of getting there is probably whether we have a sense of equality and inclusion or not. The countries that work the best are the countries where there is a sense of society and inclusion. And mechanistically, societies that work the best are the ones with the lowest Gini coefficient, the measure of income or wealth inequality. So whether it's in this pandemic, or whether it's in sustainability, or whether it's in life expectancy, or other objectives, my favorite countries have long been the social democracies of Northern Europe. They're not perfect by any means. I actually don't like how Sweden addressed this particular crisis, but Norway, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Iceland do a fantastic job in general, because it's kind of natural also, given, of course, ethnic homogeneity and so on, that they treat their society as a whole. What's happened in the United States is that that sense of the wholeness of society has been so much attacked. It's almost gone. It was never quite there because we were a conquest society and a slave society and an unequal society from the start. And that makes everything harder in the US to see even the possibility of government. For many things, many voters vote against their own interests because they say, no way I'm going to help that other group or that other person. And so there's an anti-government sentiment that comes from the lack of social solidarity to begin with. So my answer is I'm not ready to give up on government. I just know too many problems with the idea that it's going to be a decentralized, self-empowering solution. I don't believe that. I believe government is key. I believe redistribution of income and wealth is key. I believe social democratic norms are key. Maybe I'm wrong and old-fashioned in this, but that's my view. And I believe that for those to take hold, part of it has to be a culture, a group culture, that we're all in this together. Now, if we had that kind of inclusive culture, we would get away from the myth of the rich who think, all right, so the planet's going to go to hell, but I'm in my gated community, or I'm in the Hamptons, or I'm on Nantucket, or I'm going to Mars. If you're really into the tens of billions, you go to Mars instead.
Right.
But it is this sense, we don't have to solve all of that mess out there. We're protected. And I think that is part of the devastation. If Jeffrey Bezos, with his $190 billion of wealth, felt more connected to American society other than just making money, he'd be rolling up his sleeves saying, how do I help end this pandemic right now? I'm really good organizationally. What can I do? Right. But this is not what's happening exactly. We have this pseudo-individualism, but it's really a kind of a nasty orneriness that you take what you can and the rest be damned. That's very, very debilitating for problem solving. I'm not giving up, as I said, but I do think that there's a cultural element to this.
So I want to race through. There's a few more questions that came in, and then I want to end it with the role of academia, where we both still hang our main hat. It's been a really a pleasure to settle in at the Earth Institute, which you shaped for so long so well. And Alex Halliday is an able successor now, building a climate school, among other things. So we'll talk about that in a second, but let's get to some of these questions because they're really good. Samshad Naureen, I assume from Bangladesh, said how populous developing countries like Bangladesh with huge population density with less land, how can they meet the SDGs in current pandemic situation? Oh boy.
Yeah,
that's a tough question.
Well, Bangladesh is in a desperate situation, to tell you the truth. If you look out on a horizon of 50 to 100 years, if we don't get climate change under control, we know that the risks of multi-meter sea level rise are profound. And Bangladesh is a delta of the Brahmaputra and Ganges that would lose a huge amount of territory. So I worry deeply for Bangladesh and want Bangladesh and other countries in its situation to be absolutely demanding action to end the selfishness of the United States and other major polluters, to say no. We have so many tens or even 100 to 200 million people at stake right now that we don't have this multi-meter sea level rise. But this is a no joke, and the pandemic is scary enough. But if you look in the longer term, Bangladesh is extremely vulnerable, and it depends on a global response being made to the climate change risk.
We have a presentation coming out, a webcast on Friday on climate and migration. We'll be talking a lot more about that interconnectedness. There's also here Uma Chandran says, how do you bring all this to the attention of policymakers in a country like Malaysia, especially at this time when kickstarting the economy is the main focus? I guess that, that gets to this big question that everyone's asking right now. We have to reboot the economy. Why do we think about these longer term things? Right now, we have to think about the emergency of the economy right now. And that seems to be a tough dynamic.
Well, the first dynamic is we have to think about the emergency of the virus. We have to stop transmission, forget recovering the economy until we contain, suppress the virus. But then we're going to need, again, government investment-led recovery. This is the moment to say we're going in the right direction, not to invest on dirty, polluting industries that we're going to have to scrap in the future, but we're going to invest on renewable energy, digital access for all, exactly the transformations we need. So there's a real movement underway worldwide for a green and inclusive digital recovery based on renewable energy. And I think that we have a real political chance for that with President Biden coming in, as we've assumed for our purposes, and with the European Union's green plan, the European Green Deal, and the new recovery plan. And I think with cooperation, we'll get China on a green belt and road initiative. There's a real opportunity for building back the better way, not the old way, but the way that we need to go for the future we want.
So Ian Stewart, who's a good friend of mine from the world of disaster risk reduction, he's a geologist and an explorer, National Geographic explorer, asks, do we need a repurposing of universities to drive sustainable human progress? Let me go through a couple of them just so we get them out before we end. Can you go a couple minutes late, Jeff?
I can, yeah.
That's a miracle. Okay, great.
We'll do it.
Scott Murto says, I get the sense, this is a kind of a granular one, but important. I get the sense from the recent Oxford Martin macroeconomic lectures that the IMF is wanting to expand the special drawing rights approach to wider regional initiatives. Uma, I think we got Uma.
Oops.
Uma says the pandemic has shown when politicians fracture the wholeness of society, we lose everything, which is a point you've been making in spades. A lesson for us all. We have to preserve inclusiveness despite the politicians. And JP Isham, who's been here frequently, says, how do we motivate the top financial leaders, Bezos, Musk, Zuckerberg, to be stewards of sustainability? What can we do to encourage them to be the best global citizens? Those three could impact more than most countries, these are such great questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mario Ceruti says, thanks to Professor Sachs sharing his view, shouldn't we bring a bit back in establishing important values for all mankind? The role of values, you and I, we were at the Vatican that week in 2014 for the Sustainable Humanity, Sustainable Nature, our responsibility meeting, which was all about integrating values, ethics, data, cultural diversity, basic philosophy into creating a global ethic. I think that was what came up with Heriberto Cabezas as well. So that's quite a menu of final thoughts there. Would you like to offer a quick a quick round of thinking, and then we can
I,
close things out.
I would. First, I'd like to make a shout out to Mario Cerruti, who is the great leader of sustainability for Lavazza and works all over the world for sustainable coffee and for sustainable communities. And it's just absolutely wonderful work and really inspiring work. Yes, we need the values. And that's why I believe that Pope Francis and his encyclical Laudato Si is so vital for what we need. Pope Francis says that our interdependence obliges us to think of a plan for our common home. And this is the moral point. It is our common home, and it is the values that can save us. We have to open our eyes to that. Pope Francis also talks about the globalization of indifference. It's even worse with our politicians. I won't belabor the point at this late hour, but we have too many politicians who are worse than indifferent. They are vicious, and this we can't accept. Too dangerous for humanity. Do we need to repurpose our universities? This is really a great place to close, because universities, in my view, have played a fundamental role, I'm proud to say, in civilization for the last 1,000 years in the European context. Some of our oldest universities are 800 or 900 years old, and that network of universities was a transformative part of creating a world of knowledge and insight and learning. But universities need continually to update and upgrade their role. For the last 25 years, I've been leading organizations at universities, at Harvard and then at Columbia University with the Earth Institute, and now with the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, urging universities to roll up the sleeves and get into nitty-gritty, complex, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary problem solving at a local to global scale. Use the knowledge, apply the knowledge. Don't see knowledge as something separate from practice. Understand that knowledge is for the common good, and that you can't even understand without being engaged in practice. A little bit like you would say is normal at a medical school, which is keeping people alive and learning how to be a doctor. We need universities that are purposed for the 21st century to be major contributors to global problem solving. And I'm so proud of Columbia University, my home base, and Andy's home base, for providing that spirit, and for President Bollinger to be really committed to that vision, including a new climate school and new major global initiatives for international problem solving and cooperation. And I'm privileged to be working with universities around the world in the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network that are committed to this transformation. And I'll just to close, Andy, by saying that we had a meeting with the Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General of the UN last week, or on July 9-10, I should say. And in that meeting, the university leaders, the rectors, vice chancellors, presidents, representing universities all over the world, committed their universities to this kind of action. So it was really very, very important and very inspiring.
That is a wonderful place to end this conversation. And all of my webcasts here, I feel, are just the beginning. I hope you can come back.
Absolutely. It's so much fun.
It's a learn and adjust world. And we have to learn and iterate and bring in other voices. That's kind of what I do here. Thank you again, Jeff Sachs, Director of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Head of the Lancet Commission on COVID-19, working on the Amazon, working as an economist and teaching at the Center for Sustainable Development, Columbia. Glad to be, let me do whatever I can to drive us toward these goals. Not just the SDG goals by numbers, but the broad goals of having a world that's inclusive and resilient and transparent. I end this always with a little bit of a call to Friday. Well, I'm doing these 4 times a week, which is kind of nuts, but it's an important, it feels like a time to be really trying to drive conversations. ProPublica had a great, big and novel report in the New York Times Magazine and ProPublica last week on climate and migration, focused on Central America. The reporter Abram Lustgarten and some of the scientists will be on this conversation on Friday. To me, the novelty is having science in the newsroom instead of the newsroom reporting on science. Here, they actually ran a model, developed a model to help drive the reporting. So, and this initiative is part of the Earth Institute. This webcast is part of my work at the Earth Institute, building an initiative on communication and sustainability. Trying to make information matter in a noisy, fast-forward planet. I hope you'll share what you've seen here with others far and wide. You just share the link you've been watching on, and note that we do this 3 or 4 times a week, and we hope you come with ideas at the bottom of the screen. There's easy ways to reach me to get a hold of me with ideas for this going forward. Thank you again, Jeff Sachs. Good luck with the rest of your Zoom day.
Great, thank you.
And let's keep working.
All
right.
Bye-bye.
Hasta mañana.